My two guests will represent themselves. First, Noam Chomsky is professor of linguistics at MIT and the author of Deterring Democracy. He's in the studios of WBUR in Boston. Professor Chomsky, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Christopher Hitchens is a columnist for The Nation and Washington editor for Harper's Magazine. He's here in Studio One in Washington. Christopher Hitchens, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
When we talk about political discourse in the United States, Mr. Hitchens, what typically are we talking about? And I want to confine my remarks, at least in the beginning, to broadcast media.
Let me give you a topical example then, just to start with. Governor Brown of California, Jerry Brown, went on the PBS candidate selection first draft debate, and he attacked the corporate sponsorship of the program. He attacked the record of the administration on invisible government, the Iran-Contra connection, the overseas and domestic racketeering. He attacked the domination of politics by political action committees, and he accused his own party of being complicit with all of this. He was running, in a sense, against the Democratic Party, too. Various attempts were made to shut him up at the time, which probably some of you remember. I held no particular brief for Governor Brown. I was interested, though, to see. He was the only candidate to mention or do any of these things. I was interested to see in the Washington Post report of the thing, his performance was described as disruptive. This is in a news story. Now, naturally, the question is, disruptive of what? Or disruptive of whom? The answer to that is, in the mind of the Washington Post, that's a stupid question. To the consensus, which it is our responsibility to guard. We are the brackets, the enclosing brackets, that define what can and cannot be sensibly said. And
we meaning the media, we meaning the Washington Post.
Yes, and this fell unpardonably outside them. Therefore, to all intents and purposes, and since then, that candidate and his program do not exist. They are not mainstream. It's a vulgar example, but it's one that comes to hand, and you asked me to talk about an electronic instance. I had to use a print reinforcement, but I think the same point holds.
It's interesting, because I actually, when one goes into a magazine store, one sees a lot of different publications that exist out there. Whether you would find the diversity in the Washington Post that you find actually on the racks of the print media in the United States, I think it would be fairly predictable to find a more narrow range of opinions in the Washington Post, but that doesn't get them off the hook. Professor Chomsky, when you look at political debate in this country and see mainstream discussion of issues, and I hesitate to use even the word mainstream, what is it that you see, and what do you think is notably absent from that debate?
Well, let me also take a topical example, in fact, one that's a few minutes old. I just got into the studio in time to pick up a piece of the news, 2 o'clock news, and as I put my earphones on, there was a discussion of the UN moves with regard to the alleged Libyan involvement in the Lockerbie bombing. Now, that's a good news story. And in fact, if we had an independent media, they would immediately raise some obvious questions. The coverage of that story is pretty much as it was on the 2 o'clock news. It is framed by those with power. However, independent media would not accept that framing. They would ask about the question, a more general question. So, for example, the Lockerbie bombing was an atrocity, but it's not the only one. The worst air tragedy of this decade was in 1985, an Air India flight that was blown up with, I think, about 330 people killed. That bombing was traced back to terrorists who were trained in a camp for paramilitary mercenaries in Alabama with close ties to U.S. intelligence, apparently involved in Central American terrorism and so on. Edwin Meese, who was then head of Justice Department, in fact, in a roundabout way, confirmed that. He went to India 9 months later and said something about how, this was sick terrorists trained there, apparently. He said, well, we'll see that doesn't happen any longer. Well, there's a case of a major terrorist act traceable back to the United States. Or take a more recent one. As part of the U.S., a decisive part of the U.S. support for Saddam Hussein in the Iran-Iraq war, one of the final moves, which in fact brought Iran to capitulate, was the downing of a commercial Iranian airliner by the U.S. Vincennes, killing, I think, 290 people or so. That was regarded, that's not discussed, that's regarded just as an accident. The press and the NPR and so on termed it that way. However, that's not the way it was described by others. For example, by Commander David Carlson, who was the commander of a nearby vessel, who in fact had an article in the Naval Institute Proceedings in which he describes how he watched in amazement as the Vincennes focused its high-tech missile system on what was obviously a commercial airliner in commercial airspace and shot it down. And he says apparently out of an interest in testing its Aegis missile system.
Let me focus on that for a second. You're saying that an officer on the Vincennes,
commander of a nearby
vessel, saw on his radar screen what he believed to be a commercial jet, and he watched the command and control of the Vincennes focus on.
He says we watched something like, I can't remember the exact wording, but something like we watched in amazement as the commander of the Vincennes focused his Aegis system on what was obviously a commercial airliner, apparently out of an interest in testing it. There's a final act to this
Testing
story.
It on a commercial jetliner?
Look, I'm not telling you.
I know.
I wasn't there. That's what's in the Naval Institute
I'm not challenging
Proceedings.
you. I just want to be precise.
Now, the final act of this little drama was by George Bush, who gave the Legion of Merit Award to the commander of the Vincennes and to the deck officer in charge of anti-air warfare for meritorious service and the cool and etc. Atmosphere in their command during this little stint in the Persian Gulf, in which this was the only incident. Well, now I just mentioned at random two cases that might be brought up in a discussion of air terrorism, but those are not presented by the system of power, of corporate state power, and therefore the media do not talk about them. They take as their agenda what's provided for them by those in power. Independent media, which were not constrained by the demands of power, would of course immediately look at these and numerous other similar cases.
So would you view that the media in the United States has dropped the ball, has become a set of vested corporate interests, as you say, or that in some sense Americans choose to narrow their political perspectives? And if President Bush says the Libyans are criminals, then, I really don't want to think too much about it.
Well, first of all, I would change the tenses there. It's not that the media have become, it's that they always were. Mm-hmm. In fact, in my view, they're more open today than they were, say, 30 years ago. And as for what Americans believe, well, that's an interesting question, and you can study it. For example, you can ask the media often say, well, we're just responding to what the people want, and that's testable. There are many cases where popular opinion happens to be dramatically opposed to the main, the establishment opinion, let's say corporate government opinion, and then we can look at those cases and see where the media go, and they always invariably, as far as I know, on crucial cases, go against popular opinion and with the corporate media opinion. There's many, many examples. If you like, I can give you a bunch of them.
Let's get a comment from Christopher Hitchens. I recall you during the Gulf War. I was over in Israel at the time in a fairly celebrated debate with Charlton Heston, who I suppose is just an expert in agreeing with President Bush, and that was why he was booked on the program at the time. But I do recall that you and he debated the war and the morality of the war in some sense and got into a very spirited debate. And I wouldn't want to debate you after seeing that myself. And I think he ended up being unable to identify certain fairly elementary countries in the Middle East at the conclusion of the debate. But what struck me in watching it on CNN in the midst of the Gulf War story was how little that content, that sort of format, elicited any interesting information really about the war, other than the sort of skill of a debater, Christopher Hitchens, and the somewhat morally outraged doofiness of one actor, Charlton Heston. Do you think debate on the media elucidates anything?
Well, I don't think that it need not or cannot, because there's no way finally that once people are on the air, they can be, any more than you can constrain me, constrained in what they say. However, the questions that are asked or the topics that are to be addressed are usually pretty narrow. On the day you refer to, I remember thinking, well, it just must be that CNN's Rolodex had spun round to H that day, and they'd sort of, decided they'd have Hitchens and Heston. And though I was allowed to have a go at old Moses himself on this great subject, what struck me was that at every single ad break and pause break, they would insist, at least one person would come on, sometimes two, to say, we want to stress that Mr. Hitchens is speaking entirely in his personal capacity. What you've just seen is merely the ravings of this guy's name begins with H. We are not responsible for the... Oh, yeah. Very, very important to sort of quarantine, or perhaps I'm not allowed to say this on the air, prophylactic. It was sort of wrapped around me so that, as it were, it's the clown hour on CNN. This isn't serious at all. If it was serious, you'd know, because it would be Brent Scowcroft. That would be real.
I want to point out to our listeners that Christopher Hitchens represents only himself, and does not represent all people in straitjackets.
Now, for example, if we stay with that very subject, people write to me a lot and say, why do we never have Noam Chomsky on the airways? Why we don't see him? And I write back and say, well, it's because he doesn't fit what they think counts as an expert, and so on. Well, one thing, he knows too much. For another thing, he takes an opposition view. But there's another reason why I think, even if Noam was on Nightline, it might be pretty hopeless. Let me set the scene for you. It's Nightline. Ted Koppel, or one of the other priesthood, is on. He says, well, tonight we leave Scowcroft and Moshe Arens and some Saudi prince, and so we say, now we've got Professor at MIT. Noam Chomsky, do you think it would be in our interests to trade a short-term settlement freeze on the West Bank for a $2 billion loan guarantee? And remember that we're running out of time here. I want a very quick answer. The fact is, the whole grammar of the question, from the point of view of anyone who's studied the subject and has any interest in justice and so on, is a stupid question. You would hardly have time to point out the false assumptions contained within it, but it would all have to be framed in terms of of our interests, which are assumed, our common membership in a family rather than a divided society, which is intended to be conveyed by we. All of that couldn't, I think, be vanquished, even by someone like Professor Chomsky, in the time that would be allowed it. So it isn't just, as I write back to people who say this, it's not just who you see on the air. It's the assumptions that govern discourse. It's the assumptions that say, if James Baker says he's on a peace mission, he's on a peace mission. We call it Secretary Baker's peace mission. It's for him to prove, but we don't ask that.
And if I was to say, for instance, Secretary Baker's salesmanship campaign to sell a fairly questionable notion of U.S. control of emerging governments in Eastern Europe, that I would be laughed off the air.
Well, so you would, but you needn't. I mean, we needn't take it that far. We could simply describe it as a diplomatic mission. But to say peace mission, as it's always called, and the peace process, as it's always called, when anyone who's studied it knows it's neither of the above, makes two assumptions. One is that of altruism, in a sense, with all the good things that come from the word peace. The other is that of the United States as a disinterested superpower with no involvement of its own, merely trying to compose a wild quarrel among barbarous people, spending its own time and money on this enterprise and being totally above the battle. Every time you hear peace mission and peace process, that is what's really being told you.
All right, let's take some calls. This is Talk of the Nation, 800-989-TALK, 800-989-8255 is the number here in Studio One. If you have a question for Christopher Hitchens, columnist for The Nation and the Washington editor for Harper's Magazine, or Professor Noam Chomsky, professor of linguistics at MIT and the author of Deterring Democracy, among other books, which are certainly available. All this is available, even if Noam Chomsky is not available on Nightline, and I hope someday that you're asked that question, Professor Chomsky. From San Diego, California, Charles, you're on the air.
Yes. First of all, what an honor to be on the air with the stellar people you have. Dr. Chomsky and Mr. Hitchens are absolutely leading lights. Out of curiosity, I think the first thing needs to be asked is what political discourse? In an age of bumper sticker issues and fortune-cooking policies, where the primary thrust of the media or the politicians seems to be to adhere to Milo Frank's dictum of get your point across in 30 seconds or less, there is no space for discourse. Ironically, today is Lincoln's birthday. The Lincoln-Douglas debates would attract thousands of people, 3,500 to 7,000 people, and they went on for up to 10 hours with food breaks and restroom breaks and all of that going on all the time. Tell me what politician today could advertise that they were going to have a 3-hour discourse in any public
Billy
venue
Graham.
in this country
Billy
and draw
Graham.
more than 100 people.
Billy Graham, Charles. He does it all the time.
No, I said political.
Right. Good point. Do you have a question for Professor Chomsky or Christopher Hitchens?
Yes. why are these men? Why are you men allotted only an hour? You should be on at least an hour a day for a year.
Well,
maybe that's to John.
If I can make a brief comment, when listening to Chris and also to your comment, I was reminded of one of my favorite radio interviews with a gentleman named Jeff Greenfield, who I think may be the producer of Nightline or something like that. And he was asked on this interview, it was played for me in my own interview on the same station later, he was asked how come Chomsky is never on Nightline, and he sort of fumed for a while about he's from Neptune and this and that. But when he got
Greenfield said that, really?
Yeah, something like that. Then I think that was his word, in fact. But when he calmed down, he said, look, there's a real reason. Chomsky lacks concision. It's the first time I'd ever heard that word. And then he went on to explain it. Concision means the ability to say something in, between two commercials or something like that in 1 minute. Now, that's a crucial structural property of the American media. I've been on the media all over the world. In fact, I spent hundreds of hours on national and mainstream media in Europe and Australia and Canada and everywhere else. And to my knowledge, the United States is the only country that has this structural property. Namely, you have to get it out in a few minutes. And that's very useful, because in a few minutes you can say something that's conventional, or you can say, in which case you don't need any evidence for it, or you can say something unconventional, in which case you'd sound like you do come from Neptune. So, for example, let's take the Libyan case again, since it happens to be on my mind. If I were to say Gaddafi's a terrorist, I can do that under the conditions of concision, because I don't need any evidence. Everyone knows it. They've heard it 1,000,000 times. If I were to say George Bush is a terrorist, I would sound like I'm coming from Neptune, because I would be asked properly, what would he mean by that? I never heard that one before. But then they say, thank you, Mr. Chomsky, we have to turn for the commercial break. The same is true with regard to, say, peace process, the point that Chris Hitchens brought up. The fact of the matter is, for anyone who looks at this material, it's perfectly obvious that the United States has been opposing the peace process for 20 years. In fact, not just opposing it, but blocking it. You can tell this simply by looking at UN votes. Every year can't come to the Security Council because the United States vetoes it. In the General Assembly, where the U.S. doesn't have a veto, there are regular votes with numbers like 140 to 2 and so on, the 2 being the U.S. and Israel every year, right up to December 1990. Calling for a political settlement, which the U.S. blocks. Well, suppose somebody were to ask me, Chris's question, what do you think about the American effort in the peace process? In order to answer, the first thing I would have to say is, wait a minute, there is no U.S. peace process. The United States is opposed to the peace process. At that point, somebody would want some evidence, and at that point, the break would come. That's a striking property of the U.S. media. Now, the fact of the matter is, in every other country that I know of, in the third world or in Europe or Australia or wherever, you not only have a chance to make your 30-second statement, but you have time to back it up, to give evidence, to have interchange, to have dialogue, and so on and so forth. That virtually doesn't exist in the United States.
If I have to take a break now, am I going to get accused of some heinous crime? Just promise me you won't do that? Okay, I'm not going to take a break yet, but I may do so pretty soon. From Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Hugh, you're on the air.
Oh, hi.
Hi.
By the way, it is good to hear the Hitchens and Noam Chomsky on the radio, and they should have more access. But there should also be more access from the right. In Wisconsin, I've heard Noam Chomsky giving hour-long radio lectures. But we never hear William Shockley or Arthur Jensen or Linda Gottfredson, whose work is controversial because it doesn't fit the liberal pattern of thought.
Hugh, are you familiar with Joseph Sobran and David Mason?
No, I'm not.
All right, they're two, I suppose you might call them conservatives. They'll be on this program in the same hour tomorrow.
But let me just say one thing. Mm-hmm. The feminists who don't, every time there's a rape trial, you'll have experts from NOW or rape centers who are invariably hostile to the man, the alleged rapist. They'll be condemning him long before a jury. The AAUP report saying that girls are discriminated against in schools in math and science. It may well be genetic. There are genetic differences between men and women. The absurd liberal view, which is never contested on the newscasts or in the major media. There ought to be room for far more diverse views than I hear on radio.
Okay, thank you for calling. To both of you, there are constant accusations of this network that we're leftist, which makes me hysterical most of the time. But as far as you, particularly Christopher Hitchens, cover issues in the left, is there a kind of faddism and uniformity in the American left that maybe it doesn't dominate the media? I don't think feminists control the media particularly, but that it makes it difficult for diverse points to be heard within the American left?
No, I don't believe that's true. I mean, although I've written articles critical of positions that are cherished on the left in my time, I find that the irritating thing about that is that in a sense the two political cultures reflect upon one another. The left doesn't like to debate too much in public sometimes because it fears that the only coverage they'll get from that is of fratricide on the left, because otherwise it wouldn't be intelligible. So this has a sort of stupid, in my opinion, coercive effect on people sort of trying to keep solidarity in the ranks and that kind of thing. That, on the other hand, people who do that, I think, are responsible for their own actions and their own ways of thinking. They can't blame the consensus for that. I think I still have the former questioner's point in my mind. I mean, he's right up to a point in that the bias very much is against ideas or people who have them, and thus honest conservatives very often, I suppose one must add dishonest ones, suffer too from this, because there isn't time for them, if they want to develop a real theory, to get it across. However, in general, in my milieu, which is that of the sort of the columnist, the pundit, the gabfest show, and that kind of thing, the right has an enormous number of advantages. I mean, for example, on PBS there are, I think, 3 chat shows, all of them run by people who are associated with the National Review, which is William Buckley's magazine. It is. There is nobody to the left of Walter Mondale, I would say, who is regularly to be seen on American television. That does seem to me to be bizarre.
We're talking about the U.S. political spectrum and just how wide it is with Noam Chomsky and Christopher Hitchens. We'll take a short break. When we come back, we'll take more of your calls. If you want to get into the discussion, call us at 800-989-TALK, 800-989-8255. At 28 minutes before the hour, you're listening to Talk of the Nation from NPR News. This is Talk of the Nation. I'm John Hockenberry. We're discussing the breadth, or lack of same, of the political debate in this country. Today, we view from the left with Noam Chomsky, professor of linguistics at MIT and author of the book Deterring Democracy, and Christopher Hitchens, a columnist for The Nation and the Washington editor of Harper's Magazine. And from Lake Odessa, Michigan, Joanne, you're on the air.
Hello, I wonder why the mentally ill are the last to receive human rights and suffer the most. Every time someone's killed or some terrible crime is committed, this public outcry rises up. Well, they must have been a nut, or they were mentally ill, or something. And usually it turns out to be just another guy, but they don't forget. It comes in the paper that when a crime was committed, it's reported in the paper that he was mentally ill.
Okay, Joanne, thanks for calling, and just hold on there. She raises the Jeffrey Dahmer story, which is a very interesting example of how difficult it is to come to grips with people who are evil, or people who have people who have a systematic pattern of crime. It's much easier to call them mentally ill and to create a category that we can throw them in. Professor Chomsky, what do you think of the coverage of the Jeffrey Dahmer story? Not that the caller necessarily raised it.
To be perfectly frank, I don't feel competent to comment on it. My concentration lies elsewhere. I do think that it's quite true that we don't pay attention to people who are habitually violent and murderous, and they start in the highest places, starting with the president and on down. And there's a long record of atrocities and violence which are systematic and institutional, and we do disregard them. With regard to the particular case in question, I don't feel competent to comment.
That's fine. From Boston, Massachusetts, Pete, you're on the air. Hello, Pete.
Hi, I thank you very much for this show and all your other ones that I've heard. My comment, and hopefully will be cogent to this question. I was in 1981. When the hostages were returned, there was a morning 9 a.m. morning interview series with the hostages, and the spokesman was the highest ranking officer, Bruce
Langan.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And he was asked a question by a female member of the media. I don't know from where. I can't recall. The question was, don't you think that the U.S. should take some responsibility for your people being taken hostage because of the overthrow in the 53 regime and the funding of Savak? And he said, can't hear you. Perfectly audible to me, and I'm sure to everybody else, and probably to him. And he said, and she started again. He said, well, I can't hear you. We'll have to go on. Well, the fact that he didn't respond is indicative of something, but the fact that no one else in the media, in the major media, I should say, ever seemed to respond to this at all. There was no, or the nuclear disaster in '68 in Russia. That was never brought out, and I'd heard about it in '72 or something from some countercultural magazine.
Well,
we don't seem to dig deep enough.
If I may comment on that, take the first case, the U.S. media and the regime and the overthrow of the parliamentary regime in Iran, and then the U.S. support for the Shah till 1979. There is, in fact, a very good book by a professor of journalism, William Dorman, and I think Mansour Farhang, which studies the U.S. media on Iran very closely. I have a kind of a review of it and some other material in a book of mine called Necessary Illusions. And the main story, without going into the details, is that from 1953 until 1979, the media overwhelmingly took the position of the U.S. government that the U.S. was supporting democracy, human rights, modernization, and so on. The Shah was not called a dictator. This is the regime that had compiled one of the worst records of torture in the world, virtually all suppressed. There's just almost total submissiveness for, that's quite a long period, 53 to 79, to the official story. So it's not just the government that had some responsibility for inflicting this monstrous regime on the Iranian people and keeping it there, but it's also the responsibility of the U.S. media, which went along with very few breaks. You can look that up for details.
Well, just having experience on the Iran question, having some experience in editorial meetings on this question, one can see a residual reluctance to simply say the CIA installed the Shah. The CIA was responsible for repudiating an elected government. The same is true with Allende. The same is true with Somoza. The same is true all over the world, and the media. It's not clear to me, being sort of on the inside sometimes, why this happens, because it's such a fact. It's not clear to me why people don't say that Kissinger and Nixon started a secret war of slaughter in Laos and Cambodia. Yeah. Well, and are war criminals as a result. It's not clear why that's an obvious fact.
Well, let me tell you something about that Laos case, because I worked on it very hard. The Laos case is one I know very well. In 1968, the first credible information from respected Western correspondents, in particular the Jacques de Cornbois, the head of the Southeast Asia Bureau for Le Monde in Paris, very respected, well-known correspondent. He was an eyewitness to intensive U.S. bombing in Laos, which is at that time, in fact, probably the heaviest bombing in history. Refugee stories were coming out. I, in fact, was there and collected a lot of refugee stories. I tried very hard for a couple of years to try to get, I even appeared at editorial meetings with Time Life and the New York Times, spoke constantly to editors, wrote to them, tried to get somebody to cover the story. No, couldn't do it. In fact, the little bits of it dribbled out later. In fact,
it's amazing how much of that is still just buried.
Well, I mean, the U.S. bombing of Cambodia was the same. Yeah. I mean, for example, the New York Times had correspondents there, like Sidney Schanberg. Mm-hmm. They virtually never interviewed refugees. That's one of the reasons we know so little about the U.S. bombing of inner Cambodia, which probably killed maybe hundreds of thousands of people.
Yeah, but it is a story when they're killing each other. That's a story.
But doesn't that make it fascinating that the present administration and many of its partisans and supporters are firmly convinced that the press is a determined anti-imperialist critic and that it's always been trying to lose America the war? And they've succeeded in corralling quite a bit of public opinion to the view, for example, that Vietnam was lost by the media. That's a very widely held opinion in official Washington, as I can testify. And there's a, perhaps I should call it, trickle-down effect of that opinion on public opinion too, even though if you look at the record, you find that with Vietnam also, the press share the general assumption of the administration.
For most of it, and indeed it was very late that the press turned around in any really.
So it is. There's a sort of fork here on which critical journalists can very easily get impaled. And what I think happens, and has certainly happened in cases like our hometown paper, the Washington Post, is that they're very, very determined to deflect that criticism. Mm-hmm. They're extremely keen. Ben Bradley, in his farewell interview as editor of the Washington Post, said, "We had become so convinced that the Nixonites were right in thinking we were liberals, that we gave Reagan much more of the benefit of the doubt than we ever gave to Carter. And people who want to know why the Reagan regime got such a free ride from the press need only really look up that interview." Fully internalizing, in other words, the assumptions of the consensus.
From Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, Adam, you're on the air.
Yeah, hi. I think that we can go on and talk about the cases of media problems and list them, but I was wondering if anybody had a suggestion about how we could attack this problem so that the information can start getting out. We have NPR, The Nation, there are sources, but what's a way to start making people aware that they have to read between the lines when they read the New York Times, that they have to read into stories a little bit and have some background? What's a good way to attack that?
Thanks for calling, Adam. I think that things are changing on this, but Christopher Hitchens, I'm interested in your...
Well, if just, we can only talk to those who are listening, but, I think a thing to do is to just count up in your daily paper every day, wherever you live, how many of the stories begin either with a statement by the government, simply says, this is what the government said yesterday, one department or one spokesman or other. It merely tells you what yesterday's interpretation of events by the state happened to be. Or is based on a rewritten opinion poll that says we think this, or the consensus is shifting or perhaps firming up on that. If you look at the number of stories in your paper that begin in one or other of those two ways, which I think are deeply connected, because it's very easy to decide what the question in an opinion poll is going to be, because they look at what the press is saying and what the TV is saying, and they in turn look at what the opinion polls are demanding, you get a multiply reinforced sense of the grand we, of which anyone out there who doesn't feel a part should take the steps I suggest.
Adam, do you think we've advocated the violent overthrow of the American government yet during this hour?
Yeah, I think this program, I think you should all be shot dead.
Okay, thank you very much for calling.
Thanks.
Bye-bye. From North Plainfield, New Jersey, Manny, you're on the air.
Hello, gentlemen. With all the trials that have been going on, all the coverage that's been happening on these trials, how come we haven't heard, or we've heard very little about the Noriega trial? After all, we fought a war to get him, and we made an invasion, let's put it that way. And is that a political decision? Is that some sort of cover-up? What do you think?
Professor Chomsky?
Well, the European press, in fact, has commented on the remarkable lack of attention given to the Noriega trial by the U.S. media, and it is, in fact, remarkable. I think you could probably read more about it in the Financial Times in London than in the New York Times.
Yeah, we should do a show on Noriega.
Yeah. Actually, it's quite an interest, and in fact, there are quite interesting issues there. The fact of the matter is, first of all, the major issues have been kept out. The judge and the government have succeeded in eliminating most of the issues. There are also some extremely fundamental questions, like if the United States has the right to invade another country and kill hundreds of people and destroy large parts of it in order to capture someone who they put on trial, does Nicaragua have the right to invade the United States to capture a man who was convicted by the International Court of Justice, the World Court, for the unlawful use of force against Noriega and then against Nicaragua, and then just dismissed the indictment? Does Gaddafi have the right to invade the United States to capture somebody who bombed Tripoli and Benghazi on totally fraudulent pretenses, and on and on? Those issues don't arise. The question of Noriega's involvement with the U.S. government, which was extreme, we sort of know the background, that barely arises. The question why the United States turned against Noriega after having supported him for years, that doesn't arise. In fact, if you look at the indictment of Noriega, you'll notice that the charges against him are almost entirely from the period when the United States was backing him. That question doesn't arise, and we could go on and on. If the media were to cover the trial, it would be difficult to avoid questions like this. It would also be difficult to avoid the fact that the results of the trial so far indicate that the U.S. has released and given benefits to major drug peddlers, some of the top people in the field, like later, in order to try to get after this minor figure who they're trying to get rid of for their own special purposes.
And distribution has increased.
And in fact, the General Accounting Office Congress just estimated that drug peddling and money laundering is flourishing, and drug peddling has perhaps doubled since the invasion.
From Philadelphia, Steve, you're on the air.
Yes, I just wanted to say thank you. It's for those of us who know Mr. Chomsky and Mr. Hitchens through the written word, it's a miracle almost to hear them in person on radio, and I thank you for letting them be there. And I just wanted to ask a couple questions and make a comment. Mr. Chomsky is absolutely right. that the men who commit violence and terrorism actually, sometimes it goes right to the top, and specifically starting in 1981, these past 11 years have been proof of that. The whole question of the Contras, Nicaragua, El Salvador, you name it, the trials were all whitewashes. Practically everybody that had anything to do with the worst parts of it. Tens of thousands of people died in those countries. In Panama, some 3,000 families still don't have their homes, which were bombed out by the Americans, supposedly in order to get Noriega. And
do you have a question, Steve?
My question, I guess, is to both of you, Mr. Chomsky and Mr. Hitchens, if Americans, will they ever find out the results of the Gulf War? I mean, I was overwhelmed at the flag waving and the yellow ribboning all over the place, and the fact that those of us who were against it always had to defend ourselves by saying, "Oh, we're for the troops, but we're against the war." Will this change anything? I mean, will it ever come out? It seems to me the only person who gets partway there is Bill Moyers on public television.
Christopher Hitchens?
He produces his own shows, and so far he's caught everything from Reagan's religious right friends through Nicaragua, and most recently he did a piece on after the Gulf War. And to this day, the Americans don't realize what's happening to people who are continuing to die, especially children. And,
sure, Steve. Let's get a comment from Christopher Hitchens.
I mean, will we ever change?
You might want to take a look, if you can get hold of it, at an excellent documentary made by friends of mine, Andrew and Leslie Coburn, was shown on PBS not long ago, called The War We Left Behind. I thought it a very good title, because perhaps to be criticized only in one respect, in that it does suggest the war is over, whereas, in fact, as you know, the war against Iraq is continuing. And it's continuing now by the means which the administration described as contemptible and useless when they were put forward as an alternative to an actual all-out aerial bombardment, namely economic sanctions, which do have the effect of slowly starving and crippling the population of Iraq, while leaving the military caste of Saddam Hussein and his criminal Ba'ath Party in charge. Now, I was asked the other day at a public forum in Washington, sponsored by the Middle East Institute, why do you think the administration decided to spare Saddam Hussein? Because it's clear that they did. That was a decision. And I said, I think because they thought they might need him again. As they had used him before, so they might wish to return him to employment. They certainly didn't think it was worth discarding someone who had in the past been such a useful and loyal ally. Now, the fact is, if that's true, I caught a sort of note of despair almost and cynicism in the questioner's voice. If that's true, then things are really horrible, because it means that people can be fooled, which is something that those of us who consider ourselves Democrats don't like to admit, and in fact don't really believe. We don't think people are just so many units to be forced into one note of applause.
Well, let me just add to that one of the cases where the newspapers did tell the truth, and in fact I will now compliment a journalist who I rarely do compliment, the chief diplomatic correspondent of the New York Times, Thomas Friedman. At the time when the U.S. was offering tacit support to Saddam Hussein, as he slaughtered first the Shiites in the south and then the Kurds in the north, Friedman, who essentially expresses State Department views, explained why this was happening, and he put it pretty frankly and honestly, and I think accurately. He said the United States is trying to achieve what he called the best of all worlds, and the best of all worlds would be an iron-fisted Iraqi military junta which could wield the iron fist exactly as Saddam Hussein did prior to August 2nd, 1990, much to the satisfaction of the U.S. allies, Turkey and Saudi Arabia, and the only thing he didn't add is much to the satisfaction of the boss in Washington. Well, that's the answer. Sometimes you do get the truth.
Noam Chomsky and Christopher Hitchens. I'm John Hockenberry. This is Talk of the Nation from National Public Radio. From San Diego, California, Lisa, you're on the air.
Well, hi. I want to thank you all for doing what you're doing. And I also want to bring up that mainstream media did not report the Syrian government's human rights violations that were exactly the same as Saddam Hussein, and they were our ally during the war. And also the Nina Totenberg and Daniel Shore's problems they're having with the government as a result of the leaks during the Anita Hill and Clarence Thomas hearings. I remember hearing in a mass communications class years ago that he who controls the media controls the government. I think Ronald Reagan was a prime example of this, being an actor and whoever was behind him in his administration. I feel that we really, really have to be cognizant of who's supporting the media. I know that public radio is supported by. I know how public radio is supported, but the mainstream media is.
Do you really?
Well,
really?
I know
Tell us,
supported
please.
and also for donations and so forth, but he who controls the mainstream media controls the government. That's no secret. And well, anyway, I'd like to know what.
Sure, we'll get a comment, Lisa. Thank you very much for calling.
Okay, thank you.
Professor Chomsky, about Syria.
Yeah, about Syria, you're absolutely right. I mean, Hafez al-Assad of Syria is indistinguishable from Saddam Hussein.
We love the Ba'ath Party, or at least the White House loves the Ba'ath.
But he's, and in fact, don't forget that George Bush was extremely friendly to Saddam Hussein prior to the time when he disobeyed orders on August 2nd, 1990. But before that, he was a favored friend and ally. Up until August 1st, the administration was still authorizing credits, shipments, even shipments which went straight to military industries, which were later bombed.
Well, Bob Dole went there. Yeah. Senator Bob Dole was there.
So he was just a fine guy, and just as Friedman said, as long as he was wielding the iron fist in our interest. Now, with regard to your comment that he who owns the media runs the government, there's something true about that, I think, but it goes a little bit deeper. The mainstream media are major corporations, parts of even larger conglomerates. That's who owns the mainstream media, and it is absolutely true that they also dominate and control the government. We talk about the media, we talk about the government, but we don't talk very much about the corporate centers of power, and that's where real power lies in the country. As long as we don't talk about that, we're always around the periphery.
From Fairfield, Connecticut, Felix, you're on the air.
Yes, hi, thank you for taking my call. I'd like a comment on the mission of the media. I see the media lacking altruism in its mission. To me, the primary responsibility of the media is to be part of the educational process of our society. And it seems that more often than not, what they tend to do is try to entertain and do what sells more than try to help people to be more intelligent.
Although, Felix, let me ask you a question about that. I mean, would you trust Bryant Gumbel to teach you things about, Australian politics or European economics or something like that? I mean, do you really want the media to be the holders of all knowledge?
I would like them to be a part of the educational process. That's my big complaint. There isn't enough National Public Radio type media going on. The vast majority of the media is, as I say, not altruistic. I'd like a comment about how.
Sure. Yeah. Sure. We're running out of time, so I'll just let you go. Thank you very much, Felix. Okay. Christopher Hitchens.
Look, I think it's true that there are showbiz values very dominant in the media. That part of this is to do with the battle for ratings and matters of this kind, barely ideological at all. I mean, Gresham's law will occur whereby a good story about sports or sex or weather or something of the sort has a better chance than a considered.
Although that's ideological, don't you think?
Well, I think it has. I think it is. It is in the last instance. It is ideological. Mm-hmm. Yes, because it would certainly need an ideological decision to do it the other way around. Right. So exactly. Logically, yes. Yeah. But what worries me even more is the way that showbiz values have bled into what the ostensible coverage is supposed to be. I'll give you what will seem a trivial example. The other day, the president was asked. I go to these White House press conferences sometimes. I never get called, and I never will. And everybody knows that there is, in the literal sense of the term, stage management of those White House press conferences. It is decided in advance who's going to ask what question. And certain people are not going to get called. So I just go to observe when I can bear it. And Bush was asked.
So if you ever got called, we can presume that you've started to work for the CIA.
It would be a worrisome day for me if I was able to get called. I have to admit. Anyway, the leader of the free world was asked what he thought about David Duke, who was then running a campaign in Louisiana, and he said, "I want to be positioned where I can't be perceived as being at all aligned with him." He was reading from the notes of what he was supposed, the impression he was supposed to give. Instead of saying something that would lead people to perceive that he wasn't positioned anywhere near Duke, he said, "I want to be positioned where I can't be perceived as aligned with him." total postmodern intellectual chaos matched by his syntactical usual train wreck. Nobody bothered. Nobody bothered. They let him do that, went back and said, well, the president gave the expected position and perceived reply. It would only have been a story if Bush had said he liked David Duke or something.
We're almost out of time. Professor Chomsky, we have about 8 minutes. Do you have a final comment?
Well, with regard, I think the caller suggested that he gave an idealistic picture of what the media ought to be like, something that helps us understand the world. But I don't think that's the function of the media. I think if they started to carry out that function, they would be destroyed. Their function is, in fact, to distract most of the population, to marginalize them, to keep them out of what is none of their business, like public affairs.
Right.
And for the for the political class, those are decision makers. Their function is to indoctrinate them. Those functions are carried out very well.
Thanks to all of you who called this hour and to our guests, Noam Chomsky, Christopher Hitchens. Thank you very much for joining us today. Professor Chomsky is professor of linguistics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, the author of Deterring Democracy and other books. Professor Chomsky spoke with us from the studios of member station WBUR in Boston. Joining me here in Studio 1 was Christopher Hitchens, columnist for The Nation and the Washington editor of Harper's Magazine. Don't forget, tomorrow at this time on most of these public radio stations, we'll continue our discussion of the width of the political spectrum. Tomorrow, our guests include columnist Joseph Sobran and David Mason of the Heritage Foundation. That's tomorrow on Talk of the Nation. Our technical director is Liz Buchel. The audio engineers are Preston Brown, Lauren Kelly, and John Carrillo here in Washington, and David Gorin and Neil Rauch in New York. The staff pianist is Linda Lee. In Washington, I'm John Hockenberry.